Hello, everyone. This is a mini presentation where we're sharing about thinking about disability from a social justice lens. We are Jay Wilson and Morgan Brown Weingarten from the Disability Resource Center. I'm Jay Wilson. I work in student access, and I also work with the Transgender Advisory and Action Team on campus. My experience comes from living in several different disability communities. I'm autistic, I have a physical disability, and grew up with health disabilities. And very excited to think about disability from a social justice lens with you.
Alrighty. My name's Morgan Brown Weingarten. I use she, her pronouns, and I also work at the Disability Resource Center. I identify as gay and disabled, and I'm also looking forward to talking with you today. Alrighty, so we're going to talk a little bit about the different models of disability and how disability became the thing that it is today. We're going to start with some more older models that are still present today, but that's where we're going to start. And a lot of these models focus on this idea that a disabled person is bad. It's kind of black and white thinking, all or nothing, definitely along a binary. But the underlying thought behind a lot of these models is that disability is bad. So the first model we're going to talk about is the moral model. It's one of the oldest models, and it focuses on this idea that disability is a sin or it's wrong. And one major way that this was expressed during this time was through ugly laws and eugenics laws. And so those were laws that prevented people from going outside if they were disabled or engaging in society. It was not legal for them to do that. And similarly with eugenics laws, these laws prevented disabled people from having children, from, sorry. Jay, what do you usually say about this one?
Yeah, so eugenics laws were efforts to control evolution of the population by controlling individual reproduction. So it involved a lot of sterilization of people that were deemed unfit to reproduce. And sometimes that was defined in terms of disability. Sometimes that was defined regarding racial or immigration status. And has also extended into areas involving and who deserves hospital care, who deserves end of life care, and what does that look like in ways that reduce the number of people with disabilities in the population.
I'm not sure if you want to start over or
Yeah,
just like do a practice in
you
there.
can certainly start over, that's fine.
Sorry.
That's okay. Hello, welcome. Today we're doing a little mini presentation about thinking about disability from a social justice lens. My name is Jay Wilson and joined with Morgan Brown Weingarten. We're both working at the Disability Resource Center. To introduce myself in case I'm not in your live training today. My name is Jay and I prefer not to use pronouns. I work in Disability Resource Center and Student Access and also with technology and assistive technology. Also with the Transgender Action Advisory Team. I am a white person and I identify as autistic and disabled and multiple disabilities in kind of different categories. And I'm super excited to share some of the ways that disability communities have been talking about disability and engaging us in framing things in a different way from our experiences.
My name's Morgan Brown Weingarten, and I use she, her pronouns. Like Jay, I work at the Disability Resource Center as well. I am gay and disabled, and that's how I identify. And I'm also looking forward to talking with you guys about the different models of disability. So we're going to get started by talking about kind of the evolution of this idea of disability, how disability became the thing it is today. And so we're going to start just by going back in history a little bit and talking about some other models that we still will see today, but maybe they might have originated earlier in history. So a lot of these ideas that we're going to talk about, these models of disability, center around the idea that a disabled person is bad. It's kind of a binary, all or nothing. So you're either disabled or you're not. And it really focuses on kind of this general idea that being disabled or having a disability is a bad thing. So the first model that we'll talk about today is called the moral model of disability. And this is one of the oldest models of disability, and it centers around this idea that disability is wrong and that it's a sin, that for someone to be disabled, someone must have sinned. And that was really expressed through these types of laws called ugly laws and later eugenics laws. Ugly laws focused around preventing disabled people from entering into society, from going outside, from engaging in the normal ways that that people are supposed to engage. But that was illegal for disabled people at that time. Then that kind of moved into eugenics laws, which are these efforts to control who is able to procreate. People might be sterilized against their will, depending on who's deemed unfit to have children. The end result of this oftentimes is people with disabilities not being as present in society if they're not procreating. The next model we're going to talk about is the charity model of disability. And it evolves a little bit from the moral model. The way that it changes is by believing that disability is something that's tragic and sad. Ideas of pity being offered to people who have disabilities, but they still are separated from the public. This a lot of times is expressed through institutional care and the rise in that as like a primary way for people with disabilities to receive the care that they need. That is regardless of what is actually best for a person with a disability, and that is written into policy where institutional care might be the default rather than considering what a disabled person needs. The next model we're going to talk about is the medicalization model. And this focuses around the idea that a disabled person is sick or unwhole, unwell. So this might look like pathologization of different symptoms or experiences that people have through things like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which might pathologize experiences that people have. And the goal of this model is really to cure, fix, or prevent disability. And then in a situation where a cure might not be available, that person is seen as a failure, or sometimes it might seem, the perceptions might be that that person is better off dead. But the failure isn't necessarily on the person with a disability, or isn't necessarily on the medical system in that case. A lot of times that failure is put on the person who has a disability. And this still shows up today. One way that you might see this show up is that it's pretty common for individuals with disabilities to need medical documentation in order to get accommodations. And so that's really depending a lot on the medical care system rather than the person who has the disability who's requesting accommodations. The last model that we're going to talk about is the rehab model. It changes a little bit from the medicalization model but still is rooted in those ideas. This is the idea that a disabled person is abnormal. The goal of this model might be to normalize a person rather than consider their access. So that might be through normalizing things like their appearance instead of their function or their ability to sustain energy or sustain, their lifestyle or their ways of being in the world. Um, Ideas that might come from the rehab model might sound like um, believing that the wheelchair is the enemy. And so instead of viewing use of a wheelchair as something that might create access for someone to go places that they might not be able to go normally, it's instead considered a bad thing because they are not looking normal. I'm using air quotes there. Um, there's another idea that kind of comes out of this called the super crip, which might mean that a person who is disabled needs to be exceptional in a lot of areas in order to um, exist and be normalized and exist in society. And this might also look like reparative therapies with the goal of normalizing a person with a disability and kind of changing behavior that might not be considered typical rather than considering a person's needs in therapy and how they can best function or have access to their environment.
Thanks, Morgan. And just there are a lot of different ways of talking about these models. This is one way of talking about them, and this is also thinking in primarily the US and European contexts. We still see all of these today, and I think it's important to think about what they look like today. So, for example, when we're thinking about the moral model, sometimes it's about religion, but sometimes it's about the cell-reduced cure, that if you just eat healthy enough, you won't have chronic pain anymore. There are a lot of ways to be moralistic that might be about religion, might not be. Likewise, a charity model. A lot of the fundraising campaigns that we see today, namely the Muscular Dystrophy Association, has a long history of tension with how charity and pity are used for fundraising, and then how that money is used once fundraised, whether that's in line with the priorities of the people that are experiencing the disability, or whether that is for measures that deepen the gulf between people with disabilities and equal access to the world. Medicalization model certainly shows up, and this is probably one of the more predominant models that we still see today. One of the ways that that looks is the ways in which when people experience trauma and then experience mental and physical impacts because of trauma, that is viewed as a personal psychological problem to be cured, rather than as the way that we experience trauma and the way that our body responds to that. Likewise, the rehab model is still pretty predominant today. Again, we want to make sure to say healthcare and rehabilitation are absolutely important and critical, and everyone should have access to them. And this should take into account the priorities, the experiences of the people that are seeking the care, so that as people are seeking healthcare, instead of having one size fits all goals about what it looks like to the doctor to not have a disability anymore, when that may or may not be possible, that the goals are the goals of the person to live their life the way they want to live it. So as we approach the 1970s, 1980s, there were certainly some strains of this earlier in some particular disability communities. when disabled people started framing our own experiences, what gets called the social model, or there are a few other names, the social cultural models um, of disability came about. So when we're thinking about disability from community perspectives, one of the pieces is that disability in and of itself is um, complex. It's not one thing. It doesn't look the same for everybody. It's not an all or nothing proposal. People can experience disability in one area and not in another area. Um, so as we think about disability, we think about this combination of natural human differences and how bodies and minds are put together. Um, Plus this overlay of oppression and violence. And this is where the social justice framing comes in, thinking about disability in terms of how people are treated systemically, individually, rather than as a solely individual personal problem with our bodies or minds. And then we also have this piece of individual and cultural experiences and identity that comes into play. Another way of saying this is that human beings are diverse in bodies and minds. Some bodies are larger, some bodies are smaller, for example. Abilities shift through our lives, settings, cultures, and roles. So if we were to say, is a person who cannot walk disabled? We might say yes to that. However, if the person is 6 months old, we would not expect them to walk yet. And so that would not be a measure of disability in a 6-month-old. Likewise, running speed for a 20-year-old is not the same as what we would expect for running speed for a 90-year-old. And we know that individuals vary widely in whether or not they can run at all and what speed they use. What gets valued as ability or devalued as disability are social decisions. I'm going to read that again. What gets valued as ability or devalued as disability are social decisions. So a few other ways to think about this model, knowing that this is probably new for a lot of folks. Disability is a natural part of human diversity. And together with that, societies set up disabling structures to fit only certain bodies, minds, and abilities, which excludes, allows violence, discriminates against, and stigmatizes some body minds. The image on this slide, the first image, is a big box that has the first text that I read in it, and that is coming from Ollibean, Ollibean, which is a website for families, children, adults with disabilities to be in conversation together about disability from some of these perspectives. So we return to the question, what is disability? In social model, and particularly in some of the newer ways of talking about and responding to social model, disability is an intersection. We have an image here and a link in the PowerPoint to support the disabled woman of color artist by purchasing this image. You could purchase a poster for your office or clothing with this image on it, or images of any of the individual figures. Under the words disabilities and intersection, there are about 10 people of color, women of color with disabilities of all different kinds. Some are using mobility equipment, some are standing. One is using a service dog, and all of them have their fists raised in a power sign. As we think about this, we're thinking about how disability is inherently intersectional. Poverty, lack of access, and in particular, oppression greatly increase the chances that somebody might personally experience disability. And once somebody experiences disability, they're far more likely to experience poverty because of the way that we have set up systems. And so whenever we think about disability, we always want to make sure that we're thinking not just about one image of what disability looks like, but we're also thinking about how sexism, racism, classism, sizeism, and all of the other forms of oppression tie into the disability experience and inform the disability experience, and also how those forms of oppression travel together with ableism. So one of the examples we started with was the moral model, and thinking about eugenics. And that's a perfect example of eugenics were originally created to clean up the gene pool. As I said, they were created in Nazi Germany and at the US at the same time. And part of the explicit goal was removing people of color and immigrants from the gene pool. And so that's just one of many examples of how racism, xenophobia travel together with ableism. We hope that we've given you some ideas about different ways to think about disability and how to apply some of the tools that you already have in your social justice toolbox to thinking about disability.